Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're good. I'm Jack Chew. This is Chewing It Over, and most weekdays we discuss whatever is topical in the world of MSK, education, and all the things that are important to me, especially where they intersect with culture. And today I'm joined by a good friend of mine, Brad Neal. Whether he identifies as a good friend of mine, that's something we'll have to ask him when he comes on. But someone that hopefully those that are in our core audience have encountered before at things like Therapy Live, Physio Matters on at least a couple of occasions from what I recall, as well as someone that is someone that we bounce ideas off each other on a regular. We have a lot of things in common, some disagreements, always cordial, but we certainly are both really passionate about raising standards and how we might do that. And I think that one of the things that's been interesting about Brad, and certainly something I'll invite him to give us a bit of his story on, is that having gone into higher education recently, as is Brad's style, he doesn't just take that on and think, right, I'm just going to just adapt my existing skill set. He wants to raise his own standards and therefore pursues some other additional knowledge and understanding. And so in doing so, it's then opened up other lines of conversation between us, and also more ways in which Brad can get his big old brain out there and tell you guys about what he's learned as well. And so that's why it's brilliant to have him on the show. We had originally planned to do this a number of months ago. Brad had suggested this as a topic, and then we just didn't get it together logistically. Then Ben Ellis, as a comment based on mine and Ali Beverley's conversation from earlier in the week, had suggested threshold concepts as being a better way of centering a conversation about what should or shouldn't be in a higher education curriculum, namely an undergraduate, because me and Ali were frustrated at the fact that people are sometimes worrying about what should go and what should be bolted onto what courses, etc., instead of thinking more thoroughly about it. And so threshold concepts was suggested, and so fortunately Brad was free today. At the end of the show, we are going to, we think all the tech is working, and we're going to launch our Christmas advert. For those that have been following on social media, we've been threatening you with this for a week now. Came up with a silly idea. We have implemented it. We've just premiered it backstage with Brad, and he cringed his little heart out. And so we know that is exactly the impact that we're trying to have. And so we must have hit the spot. And so stay tuned for the last 5 minutes. You will have our Christmas advert. So that is going to be worth hanging around for. But anyway, let me click a few buttons and bring you Brad Neal. Brad, can you hear me?
I can, mate. How are you?
Brilliant. I'm very well, thanks, mate. Yeah, I'm all right. And are you recovered from having heard our Christmas advert backstage?
Just about. I'm not convinced I'm willing to sit through it again. So we'll see. See if I change my mind over the next 20 minutes.
Amazing. Yeah, that's brilliant. Yeah, what did you do to deserve that punishment within a few minutes of hellos? So let's get stuck into this topic then. Firstly, could you just give the listeners a bit of an update on you, because they might have last heard from you when you were at Pure Sports Medicine and also had that clinical academic role there. So you've moved on. What's the latest for you?
So back in April, I joined the team at the University of Essex. So now splitting my time between teaching and research rather than splitting my time between clinical practice, teaching and research. Fairly standard when you first go into higher education full time that you go through the process required in order to become a fellow of the Higher Education Academy, basically. So I'm almost at the point where I've finished that and will be submitting my fellowship. But threshold concepts come up an awful lot in the sort of early phases of the modules that you complete to become a fellow, as you sort of learn the sort of theoretical principles that underpin the pedagogy used in higher education.
Brilliant. So this is an area that I've heard come up a few times, and I can't remember if it was from Ash James's work last year or this year, or maybe just him signposting me to some books and reading that then it's come up in. So and I have a bit of a cursory knowledge of it, but admittedly probably fairly ignorant. But I imagine many of our audience might not know of these terms. Before I go to threshold concepts, can you just describe what pedagogy, what is being referred to when we talk about pedagogy?
So pedagogy is the science of education. Basically, it's the principles that we apply in order to deliver a learning experience to an individual or group of individuals. So in effect, it's an academic term for teaching.
Brilliant. And then threshold concepts. Then what are we referring to? And then let's get stuck into what do we feel are the implications for us in our field of understanding.
So threshold concepts are a sort of a theoretical construct within pedagogy that they're relatively recent, really. They're proposed by two educational theorists, Mayer and Land, back in the early 2000s, 2003, if my memory serves me correctly. And they're the sort of the answers on the tin, really. You know, that they consider them to be a threshold that a learner has to pass through in order to satisfy the requirements of the experience that they're gaining. So if we think about undergraduate physiotherapists, you know, they're the sort of the key deliverables that we have to achieve for someone to successfully be able to call themselves a physiotherapist. But it's more about the understanding than it is about the doing, if that makes sense.
Right, I got you. Yeah, absolutely. And the threshold, and from my understanding as well, this applies across the board, doesn't it? What the threshold is the thing that needs defining, and essentially trying to understand how people get there, what they think, how they've managed to learn, how that is then. Does it also include sort of testing and how they're measured against that, or is that less important in this instance?
So they're not sort of, they're not synonymous with examination, but as a sort of a wider principle they feed in. So degrees should be put together using a principle known as constructive alignment, which infers that in order for someone to pass a module or pass a program, it's most effective for us to be able to do that. The most effective way is to ensure alignment across the components. So the overarching aims of the module should, of the program rather, individual module aims should align to the overall program aims. And then if the pieces of assessment align well with the aims of the module and the aims of the overall program, it's very easy to then slot in what we choose to teach, because what you don't want is the aim of a program to be over there, the aim of a module to be down there somewhere, the pieces of assessment linking really poorly to the aims of the module and the program, and therefore what we teach just doesn't line up, because there's a sort of a natural, fed by lots of variables, but a sort of a natural shift in the way that learners see themselves. It's often described as the commercialization of higher education. And at times, certainly not a broad brush, but at times students see themselves ever more so as consumers, in that they are purchasing a product that will allow them, upon passing the examination of that product, to be able to call themselves, for example, a physiotherapist, and therefore go on to work as a physiotherapist. So that can, if you boil that down, that can end up being, what do I need to do in order to pass? Is this going to be on the exam? Those sorts of questions.
Sure.
Whereas as an academic, as an educator, I want you to have a learning experience. And therefore, if I line everything up well, you should get the learning experience I want and still get the bits out of it that you want, which is your degree and subsequent employment. So there's this, so often when students go out on placement, or when discussions amongst qualified colleagues, you'll quite often hear, well, why is that still on a program? Why is that still taught?
Yeah.
Or the sort of flip side of, I can't believe that isn't being taught. How on earth has that been removed from the program? And if we look at a module of study or the physiotherapy undergraduate program as these sort of individual distinct pieces, that's what feeds those conversations. That would be my interpretation of it. So if we actually flip it and look at threshold concepts, what does someone genuinely need to understand in order to function as a physiotherapist? It's slightly easier to then change the landscape of the program.
For sure. I think a charitable way of looking at it would be for us to think people are misunderstanding the wider construction of a syllabus or a curricula, call it what you will. And then the sort of uncharitable version to some would be that because of the way that these things are often constructed, is that they're not from scratch reviewed, in a sense, because they have a legacy of each institution, that you've got certain members of faculty that then have taught things for historically, and then you've got something that matures in our way of thinking that then does get added. And so when there's language such as like what me and Ali were using, where there's a perception that things need bolting on rather than integrating, is often because of the fact that there's some things that do feel like they take a fair bit of a changing, because you've got a system that's quite baked in that then is somewhat lacking that adaptation. Where do you think, because you definitely don't want misunderstanding across either of those things, and there's no doubt going to be a bit of both, or it could be in some institutions it's more one or the other. But whilst we need to join up that communication, I just wonder if I could invite your reflections on whether you feel it's one or both of those things.
I think it's both, ultimately. So every degree program in the UK is independent of others. Whilst the program has to be ratified by the CSP, by the HCPC, through the internal institutional processes, there will obviously be commonality throughout them. And the sort of the question for me is, in looking at what someone requires, or if we look at what threshold concepts are required in order for someone to cross the threshold of being an undergraduate to a qualified physiotherapist, that isn't necessarily the same threshold they will need to cross when they advance through the different phases of their career. So if we look at sort of bolt-ons and FCP roles, for example, extended scope practitioner roles, what I do now as someone that doesn't necessarily see patients, it would be unfair to expect an undergraduate program to give people the knowledge and thinking that they need in order to cross those thresholds. So for me, it's about seeking some clarity around what we need at the different phases of one's physiotherapy career, and accepting that there will be sort of commonality through them all, but then dependent on the direction you take once you're qualified, they will vary quite heavily. So
yeah, one of the fascinating things, and it came up the other day with Ali, is if though we think that some of the central features that would help someone to clear a threshold that is somewhat, let's say, universally agreed, not that that's easy, and we'll come to why and what we think those thresholds might be, but let's just say that there's a threshold that most agree on. But to clear that involves in practice education of a level that is very challenging for everyone to get, because you've got disparity of placement experiences that come from that, and so there are certain challenges that come with that. That's one of the things that seems to be central to some of the concern, is that why everyone looks to the taught syllabus is because at least there is then, and then the examined sort of criteria, is that when that is the common thread, that is known to be being taught and being examined on, that then the enhancements that would naturally come from clinical education, but you're never going to be able, and nor should we try to contain the real specifics of placements and the like. I think that's one of the reasons why it's concerning when people will say, oh, whilst we agree that is a vitally important part of education, that needs to be served on placement. It's like, well, if you're then rolling the dice on placement in a way, which you are, and I'm not meaning by quality there, obviously I'm happy to have that conversation, but I'm actually just meaning in terms of the fact that these days it's very rare that someone gets a suite of disciplines across their placement spectrum that is, say, perfect, or whatever that would be if you could, but there might be that they've had a few fairly niche and quite obscure placements that have pieced together what would become their hours. So I think for me, I do find that seems to fuel a lot of the quite blinkered approach sometimes to saying, why is that in or out of the syllabus? Does that make sense?
Absolutely, and it's why one of the things that we've done in our new program that was validated just a few years ago at Essex is we've removed the concept of core placements. We no longer set expectations for students that they will get an MSK placement, a neuro placement, a critical care placement, you will go on placement and you will see what you see on placement, and there's no guarantees as to what that will be. So if we sort of bring in another theoretical concept referred to as Bloom's taxonomy, the easy way to think about it is a triangle, obviously wider at the base and narrower at the top. And at the lower sort of ends of Bloom's taxonomy, that's the very sort of classical book knowledge or things that one must understand. And then as you go higher up the triangle, you understand how to appraise that book knowledge, and then you learn to apply that book knowledge. So all that sort of theoretical knowledge. So that's where placements come in for me. It's about the application of those skills. And I think that's how we could look at what the threshold concepts are in physiotherapy through the undergraduate lens. What do you have to be able to do in order to survive in a critical care environment, an MSK environment, a neuro rehab environment? And that's where I think some of the challenge comes from, absolutely, because I don't think we've got sort of anywhere near consensus on what those things would be.
We could mature the conversation in that direction, though. I think that this is one of the things that I really want to aspire to into next year, is that I think that finding a mechanism of having that conversation is to think. I often speak the language of competency. It feels fairly familiar, because you have to go many years for me to have been sort of banging a drum about not just aspiring to clinical excellence, of which I still do, but also just trying to set a fairly high bar and just saying, like, let's really drag standards up that way, pitch to what is perfect. Whereas this concept of what does competent mean, what does then that mean as a professional threshold in that instance, it feels fairly familiar in its language. Just want to pick up on the placement thing. Maybe I'm being cynical to think this, but I think a lot of those schools that I've spoken to that have ended up needing to not say these are core placements is partly out, not partly out of, but purely out of the practical application and not being able to fulfill that as consistently as they would like to, rather than it being a pedagogical decision. Probably not the right use of that word, but it's not that they've chosen to do that because they think that those are distinctions that are irrelevant. Now, am I wrong on that, do you think?
I can only speak for our program directly. For us, it is a pedagogical decision in that we've tried to remove the practicing in silos from our undergraduate program, and we treat people rather than conditions. And our undergraduate and pre-reg postgraduate program was redesigned just a few years ago in order to reflect that. So, for example, we have a physiotherapy-led assessment and treatment module, which covers everything from seeing someone on critical care to me poking someone's kneecap around. That's all within one module. So we've tried to remove those silos from our program. The obvious secondary logistical benefit being it's never been harder to secure the placement capacity that we need. And one of the solutions to placement capacity is to remove the need for everyone to go on core placements. And I was going to say something else before you started again, and I've just remembered what it was. The sort of reassurance I think that's required for certain people is the actual doing of skills. I don't consider to necessarily be as challenging as the understanding of what underpins when and why we might do those things. So, and my example would be if we look to the pandemic, and look at the way, bless you, the way my wife, for example, as a critical care specialist in cardiothoracics, how quickly her and her team were able to adjust to running a COVID ITU, and how easily colleagues from musculoskeletal practice, both physiotherapists and otherwise, how quickly they adapted to being ITU staff, redeployed and contributing to proning and vent management and things. So the actual hands-on doing of these things isn't anywhere near as challenging as the understanding of the when and why, which is why I think the focus needs to be on the former rather than the latter.
Yeah, and it's a failure of the toolbox model that's sometimes described, isn't it? That these things are, it's the application of how would we be solving that problem, and how do we apply our knowledge to that to drive towards a solution for that, whatever that individual that we're trying to help is. Or I think what I wonder is, and I really don't want to put you on the spot within a particular institution, but it's the confidence that we would have to have on a program for a graduate to then not have had insert placement. So I'll just be selfish as being MSK specialist as I am, that the way in which a new graduate would be able to engage with their first few months in an MSK department as a graduate, I just think that is a daunting task for someone that would not have had a MSK department placement. And I find that then, whilst the same applies across no doubt different disciplines, I think that there is something that is relevantly distinct to that than community falls services, and even more so into the ICUs and the like. So, I mean, people in the other parts of the industry, such as in neuro and stuff, have always been frustrated that someone's neuro placement might have been in something that is say hyperacute stroke or a community Parkinson's service, and then it kind of, they've been frustrated by that. And whilst I totally understand that, therefore, someone's not going to get a suite of placements that would cover all those bases, I think just in an MSK selfish moment for a second, is that, are we suggesting then that with the right design, it would not matter that someone would have had an MSK placement or a direct MSK outpatient experience and then qualify as a physiotherapist, having met the thresholds that we set?
Yeah, absolutely. That would be my take on it. You know, there's a set of understandings that require defining, but once defined, sort of knowledge that would allow someone upon graduation, irrespective of the actual placement experiences they had whilst as an undergraduate, to slip into any rotation, if we want to think about the classical model, and function quite capably.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I think, because I'm often, I've got me MSK goggles on all the time. I wonder, like, when someone's a new graduate, and they then, the first time that they ever go out to a waiting room with nothing but a name and get someone to come in to talk about their sore bits, that for me, I remember it clear as day. But I was early in my second year as a student doing that. And the security that I had surrounding me in that environment, both with the institution of which I was under a degree program on, as well as the educator, as well as the protected time I had as a student, that me and my clipboard and a name going out and saying, Mr. Smith, come and see me and we're going to talk about your sore bits. If that same moment had have been in year 4, let's say, now as a graduate, that I feel does put a lot onto the system of when we're seeing fewer and fewer preceptorships in the actual employment circumstances. That kind of is where I get a bit twitchy, and that's one of the things that concerns me. But then admittedly, you're talking about a redesign that therefore would prepare me differently, and so I accept that might just be a change or a squeamishness that I have. But I think that there is a risk that it shunts the threshold onwards into practice. I don't know. I think the specificity matters on this, I guess.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying is sort of a really nice reflection of one of the sort of structures that underpin threshold concepts, which is that once learned, they're probably impossible to unlearn. So you're leaning on your experience as an undergraduate, and there you are. I guess the flip side being, for example, let's say you enter your band 5 rotations, and your first rotation is within a mental health service or a palliative care service. You didn't have a placement that was palliative care or mental health, but that's still your first rotation. So with the ever sort of evolving scope of physiotherapists, or the ever evolving, scope's not the right word, but domains within which we function, I think it's ever more unrealistic to expect one's placement experiences when as an undergraduate to perfectly reflect everything they are likely to experience once a graduated member of staff, whether you go into NHS rotations or otherwise. So if we can gain consensus on what the sort of the underlying theory, knowledge, abilities, etc., are that cut through what is to be a physiotherapist, whether you work as the way you and I do or the way my wife does. There's a central theme, and physiotherapists are terrible for marrying other physiotherapists, aren't they? You and I are both guilty of that, and I quite often have historically said, I don't really care about what my wife does and she doesn't care about what I do, and we never talk about work. So as a result, we're both physios, but we do totally different things. So it never really comes up. But I think if I reflect on that, that was probably me being a young, arrogant clinician. And now I sit here being several years more mature and no longer seeing patients. I think actually there's probably a huge amount of commonality in everything that we both do. It just so happens that I worked in private MSK practice in London and treated people primarily with pain at the front of their knee, and she works in critical care and takes care of people after they've had a heart transplant. But
it's so funny, isn't it? Because we have such common there between us, of course, because it's a socially trendier thing to say, because people want to accuse you of talking about nothing but shop over the dinner table or pillow talk, don't they? So you almost then say it's very different, but fundamentally, reasoning, clinical reasoning at a diagnostic level, and then functional rehabilitation. Even though we said Charlotte treats poorly children and I treat well adults, it's about as different on our scope of our license as it could be. But there are some real deep roots there, and I think that's something that you do change your patter on that, don't you, as you get older. I think. Where I realised now we were never going to. I thought this might happen, and partly because I was going to try and rope you into another show, potentially with a few other guests as well, where we could actually try and nail down what might be the threshold concepts in physiotherapy and MSK. But we will get stuck into that, and we haven't got time to. But I feel like setting this down and what Tune It Over does well is at least then putting that out there as a piece of content that can be referred to and built on. That we weren't going to then solve that in half an hour, and I really do look forward to getting stuck into it, because I think. I know what you're meaning by mental health placement. And you could apply that to my experience with regards to then qualifying without having had an ICU placement. But is it relevant that I was highly unlikely to then become a respiratory physiotherapist, partly out of that experience? And I think that might happen with regards to on the flip side with MSK. I think that the likelihood of someone then qualifying having not had an MSK placement, that the experience they would have on that rotation, or their likelihood of taking what would be a specialised post, because rotations are even on the wane, I think you therefore decrease that. And again, selfishly, for me banging the MSK drum, I think that is something that we might need worry about. Now, I don't know, and it could well be that I'm criticising in saying, like, what I've known before, I need to maybe let go of. So I can't be a hypocrite on this stuff. You can't be sort of harking back in our day, this was just better inherently, and someone says why, and you can't have an answer because it's just all you know. I don't want to be that guy, but I do wonder how we can. I almost think it needs to be a profession-wide discussion, doesn't it? Because if that happens without that broader consent, then you're going to have a disrespect for the next generation that is not going to be sustainable. And we need to mentor and bring these through for the sake of our patients at the heart of it. The quality of care that they're receiving. So thanks so much for coming on, mate. Really appreciate it. Just remind people where they can find out a bit more about you, and tell me, are you willing to come back again?
Yeah, no, I think absolutely a follow-up is needed. And, I'll be so bold as to say I dropped Ben Ellis a message this morning saying, I think this is an interesting idea, and it requires a huge Delphi study to answer the question. It is genuinely a profession-wide question to ask in order to try and get people on board. So yeah, absolutely. Happy to come back.
As soon as you start talking about that, you smart Alex with all your big brains and stuff, you can do the studies and that, and I'll come and ask some numpty questions every now and again of it and broadcast it. But no, that's great, and obviously count me in, and you, Ben, and any others. I know Reena Patel as well thinks on this really well, even prior to her work with the CSP. So I think that'd be really valuable for getting her involved in. So obviously, massively interesting topic, and certainly a conversation that needs to mature for us all to improve on, not least because of what's happened with the pandemic and the disruptions to higher education, and us needing to ask those questions as to what is the entry level point that we'd be happy with. And so thanks for leading on that conversation as ever, mate. As I threatened you all with, I'm going to leave with our Christmas advert. We'll see whether Brad hangs about to cringe and heckle at it. We've really enjoyed, well, say we, I've really enjoyed bringing this together for you. The team have tolerated my idea, and I think they've come around at the last minute. 5 minutes you've got of our Christmas advert. Thank you so much. Merry Christmas. I'll see you next week for more Chewing It Over. But for now, thanks from me and Brad.
Quinn Gibson tried, Daniel Key, Toby and Lay, Quick Meekins tired, Smell Janik, Mike, Andrew Lamish, James, mere hours for Bailey, Hassan, Bradash, Dwa, Benoy, Hilton, Malin, Arisma, Sir Griffith's Line, Cuff Taylor, Clare, Patel O'Sullivan, Abram Smith, Giles, Mitchell, McCauley, Jones, Melrose, Dajo, Bello, and Belgium, Horsley, Schmidt and Steer, Roch Krajewski, Phillips, Harding, Nadim Foster, Miller, Beard, Andy, Chris March, Bells, Thatchlin, Ollie Flanny, Champion, Few, Pale Tonight, Hell's Good, Nick, Ben, Stevenson, Shoe, Ali Stokes, Pete Moses, Rabbit, Rand Smith, Chris Huff, Ryan, Sam Rhiannon, Griffiths, Jason Leary, White, Goodwin, Angus, Antoine Hall, Paul Lehman, Filio, Chew, Flick, Bevan, Smith, March, Jamuzo, Downing, Stu, Braceth, Come, Claire Robertsons, Tim, Mike, Stu, Lisu, Nawood, Deb Stanton, Ulrich, Deckers, Livy, Dasmin, Show. Neil Belton, Miller Wyatt, Reese Coleman, Becky Tucker, Grantham, James, and Baker. Deacon Smith, Graham, Mark, Scarsbrook, Karen, Mosley, Tack, and Griffin, yours, Holsworth, Thacker, Walton, Wills, and Creeman, Fair, Colker, Thompson, Brockwell, and I.
Hi everyone, thanks for listening to our silly Christmas single, and you'll be pleased to hear that there will be more content available on this channel, so do like and subscribe, but you'll also be chuffed that that's not a lot of singing from me, that's not what's planned, but lots of educational content, such as that from the 155 names I just sang, as well as many more on physio-matters.com. If you're not already, then join as a member for the best and learn from the best in MSK practice. Also, this is not a charity single you can download. It's not going to make Christmas #1, you will be surprised to hear. But in the spirit of donations, as is the nature of, say, Band-Aid, as we've just sung, then do check out freehab.co.uk and consider making a donation to one of the most exciting non-profits in our industry, where people can access MSK services and the best in the industry that are donating some of their time to actually help people to not get sat on waiting lists, but also that can't necessarily afford it, to be able to get and access brilliant care. So freehab.co.uk, delighted to be able to support them. We'll be doing that throughout next year, but here's starting with a bang with this charity single. So do donate if you can. All the best and have a great Christmas. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you for more Physio Matters and Therapy Live in 2022.